In the high desert of New Mexico Territory, in the summer of 1883, a lone rancher named Cole Hartley rode out to check his south fence line and found something that would unravel the quiet life he'd spent 2 years building around his grief. A young Apache woman. Alive, barely, clinging to the side of a smoking freight wagon that had been ambushed and set on fire. What began that afternoon as a simple rescue would cost Cole more than he had left to give, and give him back something he thought he'd lost for good. Watch this story all the way through, and if it moves you, please like and subscribe. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to where it started. The summer of 1883 came hard to the llano country of southeastern New Mexico. The sun rose mean and stayed that way, pressing down on the Red Rock mesas and the Caliche flats until the air above the ground shimmered and danced like something living. Cole Hartley had stopped noticing the heat the same way he'd stopped noticing most things. Not because he was numb to them, exactly. He'd just gotten very good at keeping his attention pointed at what was right in front of him and nowhere else. The cattle. The fence line. The well. The next chore. Cole was 34 years old. He stood 6 feet with his boots off, lean the way desert men get lean, whittled down by work and weather, and not much interest in sitting still. He'd come to the territory 7 years earlier with a wife named Clara, and later, a boy they called James, who was 2 when he died, and who had just started saying his father's name without stumbling on the L. Fever took James in the winter of 1881. Clara followed 6 weeks after, as though she couldn't bear to be in the house without him. Cole had buried them both on the low rise behind the barn, where the view opened west toward the Guadalupe Mountains, and the light fell long and golden in the evenings. He visited the graves every morning before he did anything else. He didn't know if that was healthy or not. He'd stopped asking questions like that. The ranch was small by territory standards. A few hundred acres of mixed grama grass and scrub, a stone house Cole had built himself, a good well, a barn that leaned slightly north but held. He ran about 60 head, worked them alone, kept no hired hand. Solitude had become so ordinary that he measured time not by days but by tasks. He knew the exact sound the gate latch made when the wind caught it, the particular creak of the third porch board, the way his horse Briar would flatten one ear when something was wrong. He'd learned to read the land the way other men read faces. It told him things. And on that afternoon in early July, when he rode the south fence line and the smoke appeared above the ridge, what it told him was that something was very wrong. The smoke was wrong in color. Not the pale dust-colored smoke of a campfire, but the thick orange-black churn of burning wagon canvas and oil-treated wood. Cole put his heels to Briar before he'd decided to. The horse was already moving. He came over the ridge and pulled up hard. The freight wagon sat about 40 yards below, listing to one side where a wheel had broken on the rocky trail. It was fully involved, the canvas top gone, the sideboards blackened and crumbling, a pair of draft horses lying dead in the harness. 3 bodies were scattered on the ground nearby, their clothing stripped, mule tracks and boot tracks cut deep into the soft earth around the wagon and headed north, fresh enough that the edges hadn't crumbled yet. Whoever had done this was maybe an hour ahead of him. Cole scanned the scene for movement and found it almost by accident. A shape, low against the far wheel of the wagon, in the narrow band of shadow that the burning wreck still threw. A person. Small, still, he rode down slow, one hand loose near the rifle scabbard, eyes moving. No movement from the trees, no sound except the fire. She was lying on her side, her back against the wheel, knees drawn up. Apache, he could see that at once. The fringed buckskin dress, the beadwork collar at her throat, the black hair that had come half loose from its braid and fanned across the dust. She was young, maybe 20, and her left arm was pressed tight against her ribs, where her dress was dark with blood. A cut, deep by the look of it, probably from the wagon side when it pitched. She was conscious. Barely, her eyes opened when he dismounted and came close. Dark eyes. Wary and exhausted and very much alive. He stopped 4 feet away, palms out. He didn't reach for her. He crouched down to her level. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. He meant it, and he said it quiet, the way he'd speak to a spooked horse. "The men who did this are gone north. You're safe right now." She didn't speak. Her gaze tracked from his face to his rifle to his hands and back to his face. She was measuring him. He understood that. He'd have done the same. "I've got a ranch about 2 miles east," he said. "That wound needs cleaning, or it'll go bad by morning. I can take you there." He waited. "You can leave whenever you want. I won't stop you." For a long moment she didn't move. Then, slowly, she let her right hand drop away from where she'd been bracing against the wheel. Not agreement, exactly, but not refusal. Cole went to Briar and came back with his canteen and his spare bandana. He pressed the cloth against the cut without touching anything else. She didn't flinch, but her jaw went tight. He helped her to her feet and into the saddle. She was lighter than he expected, and stronger. He led Briar on foot all the way back to the ranch, walking slow on the rough ground so she wouldn't be jolted. She didn't say a word the whole way. Neither did he. At the ranch he set her on the porch bench and went inside for clean cloth and the tin of carbolic salve he kept on the kitchen shelf. He cleaned and dressed the wound by lantern light, working quickly, keeping his attention on what he was doing. When he finished, he brought water and a plate of cold beans and cornbread from the pot he'd made that morning, set them beside her, and went to the barn to water Briar and give her whatever privacy there was to be had. When he came back, she had eaten about half the food. She was watching the gate. "My name is Cole Hartley," he said. He sat on the opposite end of the bench, a full arm's length away, and looked out at the yard the same direction she was. "This is my ranch." A long silence. Then, quietly, in English that was careful and deliberate, "I am called Nahlin." He nodded. "That's a good name. It means the one who moves before the wind," she said. "My grandmother gave it to me." Cole nodded again. He didn't ask anything else. They sat in the dark together and listened to the coyotes start up in the flats. Nahlin was Mescalero Apache, from a band that ranged the Sacramento Mountains northeast of the Tularosa Basin, country that Cole knew by name but had never crossed. She didn't offer this all at once. It came out in small pieces over the days that followed, the way information comes from someone who has learned that revealing too much at once is its own kind of danger. She told him she had been traveling with her uncle and 2 of his trading partners, heading south with a load of blankets and dried goods for the trade post at Mesilla. The raiders had appeared from a dry creek bed without warning. Her uncle had shoved her under the wagon before they reached him. She'd crawled out after the shooting stopped, after the men were gone, and pressed herself against the wheel and waited, because she didn't know what else to do and because her side hurt too much to run. Cole listened. He didn't ask about the raiders. He'd seen men's work like that before, and he didn't need to have it described. What he did not do, in those first days, was crowd her. He gave her the small room off the kitchen, Clara's sewing room, which he'd never done much with since, and he hung a new latch on the inside of the door. He brought meals and left them. He did not wait for thanks, and he did not check on her in ways that would make her feel watched. When she appeared in the kitchen doorway on the second morning, dressed and moving carefully, he just said "Coffee's on," and went back to reading the almanac he'd been holding without reading for the better part of an hour. She poured her own coffee and stood by the window and looked at the yard. He turned a page he hadn't read. That was how it was for the first week. She was not passive in her recovery. That was the thing Cole noticed and respected most. Nahlin was not the kind of woman who waited to be tended. By the 4th day she was changing her own dressing, her face composed and focused, using a folded strip of the clean cloth he'd left on the shelf. Within 2 days of being able to walk to the creek bed behind the barn, she had identified the medicinal plants growing there. Narrow-leaved yerba del oso, which she called by its mescalero name, and the small flowered horehound her grandmother had taught her to steep for fever and lung complaints. She made a poultice from the yerba del oso and replaced his carbolic dressing on the 3rd day. The wound closed cleaner than carbolic would have managed. Your grandmother taught you that, Cole said, the first time she brought the poultice to the table to prepare it. She taught me many things, Nahlin said. What the land gives you, and when to ask. Cole thought about that. I've been on this land 6 years, and I didn't know those plants were down there. She looked at him levelly. You were not looking. He had no answer for that, and she didn't seem to need one. She went back to work. By the end of the first week, she was helping with small things around the ranch without being asked. Sweeping the porch, drawing the morning water from the well before Cole was out of the barn. She did these things not out of obligation, he could tell, but because keeping busy was what she knew how to do with grief. He recognized it. He did the same thing. They ate dinner together most evenings by the second week, not always talking, often just sitting with the lamp between them and the sounds of the desert coming through the open window. The cicadas, the far-off cattle, the occasional owl. Nahlin had a way of sitting very still that Cole found oddly calming. Most of the people he'd known couldn't let a silence just be what it was. She could. Silence between them stopped feeling like an absence and started feeling like something they were sharing. One evening she asked him about the graves on the hill. He told her about Clara and James without the hedging and shortening he usually used. He said Clara had been funny, quick-witted in a way that had surprised him when they first met, because she'd seemed quiet at first and then turned out to have more angles to her than a cut piece of glass. He said James had been 2 years old and had been absolutely certain that every bird he saw was the same bird, personally following him around. He said he'd gone out to the graves every morning for over a year before he'd realized he wasn't doing it out of guilt anymore, but out of habit, and that somewhere in there, habit had become something like peace. Nahlin listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "My people believe the ones we lose do not go far. They stay near the places that knew them best." Cole looked at the window, in the direction of the hill. "I'd like to think that." "I think it is true," she said. Plainly, like a thing she knew. Not comfort. Fact. He looked at her. She was looking at the window, too. The silence that followed was the most comfortable Cole had felt in 2 years. By the third week, Nahlin had stopped sleeping with the knife she'd kept under her mattress, a short trade knife she must have had in her dress pocket during the attack. Cole had known it was there. He'd left her to it. The morning he came to the kitchen and found it lying on the counter plain as anything, he understood what that meant. He made no comment. He put the coffee pot on and went out to start chores. She had her own small rituals, and he learned to read them the way he read the land. In the early mornings, she would stand outside the east, facing wall of the stone house, and face the sunrise for a few minutes before coming inside. The mescalero greeted the dawn. She'd explained once, briefly, an acknowledgement that the day was a gift, that you were present to receive it. Cole started waking a few minutes earlier, so he'd have the coffee ready when she came in. He wasn't sure when he started doing this. He just noticed, one morning, that he was. She taught him a handful of words in her language. Not a lesson, just pieces, dropped into conversation. The mescalero Apache word for mesa was one she used often, pointing at the great red rock formation to the west that dominated their view. She called it by a name that translated roughly as the Standing Red One. She said her people had names for every landmark within 100 miles, that the land was a map of history if you knew how to read it, that every canyon and spring and ridge carried the memory of something that had happened there. "This land has memory," she said one evening. "Your maps show lines. Our maps show stories." Cole thought about that for several days. It changed how he looked at the country around the ranch. Not acreage and fence lines anymore, but a place that had been known by people long before he'd arrived with his surveyor's papers and his grief. It was in the 4th week that the trouble came. Cole had ridden into the small supply town of Cimarron Creek, half a day's ride north, for flour and lamp oil. He heard about it at the dry goods counter. 3 men asking questions. A woman they were looking for, Apache, young, from an ambushed wagon. One of them had shown a paper with a rough description and was offering money for information. The dry goods man told Cole because Cole was a known face, a reliable man. He didn't say it like a warning. He said it like gossip. Cole bought his flour and his oil and rode home at a pace that left Briar breathing hard. He told Nahlin that evening, straight and without softening it. She took it in silence, her face still. Then she asked, "How many?" "3 that I saw. Could be more." He set his hands flat on the table. "I'm not going to hand you over. That's not something that's going to happen. But I want you to know what's coming so we can deal with it together." She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was something he hadn't seen from her before. Not fear, but a careful attention, as though she was reassessing something. "You believe you can stop them," she said. "I believe I can give it a serious try." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Close to one. "Then we should be ready," she said. Nahlin knew the land around the ranch in a way that Cole, for all his years on it, did not. She had been covering it on her morning walks for 3 weeks, moving quietly in ways he hadn't tracked. She knew where the creek bed provided cover at the eastern approach, where the old adobe ruin on the north side of the property would block a rider's sightline from the road, where the ground went soft with alkali in a certain draw and would slow horses to a walk. She laid this out for him the next morning in the dirt of the yard, drawing a rough map with a stick, explaining each position plainly. Cole watched her and felt something shift in his chest, something he didn't have a name for right away. Pride was part of it. Respect was part of it. Something warmer than either. He spent the next 2 days working on the ranch's defensive position, moving the hay wagon to block the barn door, pulling the rifle and the spare shells down from the shelf in the bedroom where he'd put them after Clara died, oiling the locks, checking the cartridges. Nahlin was not idle. She prepared what she called a distraction position in the creek bed to the east, a pile of brush arranged to show movement when the wind stirred it, designed to draw attention away from the house. They didn't speak much during those 2 days. There was a kind of seriousness between them that felt different from the comfortable silences of the weeks before. Tighter, with a current running through it. The men came on a Wednesday night, just past dark. Cole heard them before he saw them. Briar, in the barn, stamping and blowing. He was out of the chair and to the window before the sound registered fully. 3 riders coming in from the north, moving quiet and spread out. The way men move when they expect resistance. He was out the back door and to the barn to quiet the horse before they made the yard. He positioned himself at the corner of the barn with the Winchester, the stone wall at his back, and watched them. They rode into the yard and stopped. "Hartley," one of them called. A big man, heavy in the saddle, wearing a coat despite the heat. "We know you got the Apache woman. We ain't here to cause trouble with you. Just give her up, and we'll be on our way." "She's not property to give," Cole said, from the shadow of the barn. He kept his voice level. "She's a free person who's under my protection. You can ride back the way you came." The big man turned toward the sound of Cole's voice. He hadn't pinpointed the position yet. "We got a contract. She was on a wagon with goods that belonged to our employer. We're just recovering property." "I heard what you did to the men on that wagon," Cole said. "That wasn't recovery. And she's not goods. Ride out." A pause. Then, from the right flank, one of the other riders broke toward the barn, fast, expecting Cole to be at the door. He wasn't at the door. The shot came from the creek bed to the east. Nahlin had gotten to her position without him knowing. She'd gone out the back window of the sewing room while Cole had been watching the yard. She fired once, into the ground in front of the flanking rider's horse, close enough to wheel the animal and send it sideways. Not a killing shot, a stop shot. It worked. The horse screamed and shied hard, and the rider was too busy staying in the saddle to do anything else. The big man in the coat swung toward the creek bed and fired. Cole moved from the barn corner and covered the distance to the yard at a run, putting himself between the man and the creek bed. He heard the first shot pass somewhere to his left. The second one found him, It caught him in the left shoulder, high, and spun him half around. He kept his feet and kept the rifle and put a round into the dirt directly under the big man's horse, close enough to scatter grit across the animal's legs. The horse bolted. The big man went with it, hauling at the reins, and the third rider, who had been hanging back, followed without being asked. The flanking rider, still fighting his spooked horse, read the situation and went after them. Cole stood in the middle of the yard in the dark and listened to the hoofbeats diminish to the north. His shoulder was burning badly. He sat down in the dirt. Nahlin was at his side in 2 minutes. She'd crossed the creek bed and come through the fence at a run. She was breathing hard, her face level and focused. She pushed his hand aside and looked at the wound in the darkness. Her hands were steady. "Through," she said. "It went through." "That's the good kind," he said. She made a sound in her throat that might have been agreement or exasperation. She helped him inside. She worked on the wound by lamplight for the better part of an hour. He sat at the kitchen table without complaint, his jaw tight and his right hand flat on the wood. She packed the wound with a drawing poultice of her own making, working with the same precise economy he'd come to recognize. No wasted motion, no drama, nothing theatrical about her focus. When the work was done, she poured him a cup of whiskey he hadn't asked for, and set it in front of him and sat across the table. He looked at her. "You went out the window," he said. "You were watching the yard. I didn't tell you to go to the creek bed." "No," she said. "You didn't need to." He thought about that. He picked up the whiskey and took a drink and set it down and looked at his hand on the table. "You saved us," he said. "Your shot turned that rider. If he'd made the barn corner, I'd have been in the open." Nahlin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You walked into the open, with their guns pointed at you. I was trying to give you a target. I know what you were doing." She was looking at him steadily. Her voice was very quiet. "In my life, Cole Hartley, no one has ever stood between me and a loaded gun." He met her eyes across the table. The lamp was low, the shadows in the room were long, and the only sound was the creek winding down past the fence and the distant coyotes starting up again as they always did past midnight. Her face, in that light, was composed and still, and open in a way it hadn't been on that first evening on the porch. Something had lowered in her. Some last guard had come down. For a long time, neither of them said anything. That was enough. The men did not come back. Cole sent word to the territorial sheriff's office in Mesilla 2 days later, riding one armed into Cimarron Creek with a written account of what had happened. Whether it amounted to anything legally was a question he couldn't answer. But they did not come back. Cole's shoulder healed slowly. 4 weeks before he could lift the arm above the waist, 6 before he was fully functional. Nahlin tended it through all of it, replacing the poultice every 2 days, monitoring the wound's color with the same attention she'd given her own injury weeks earlier. Cole was not a good patient, meaning he tried repeatedly to do things he wasn't supposed to do, and Nahlin was not indulgent with this, meaning she told him so directly and without cushioning it. He found, to his own surprise, that he didn't mind. During those weeks of slower work, they talked more than they had since she arrived. Long evenings, the lamp turned down, the desert cooling outside the window. She talked about the Sacramento Mountains, the way the high country smelled in the summer when the pine sap ran and the afternoon rains came up from the south, the way the band moved between elevations through the seasons, following the game and the available water. She talked about her grandmother, who had been the keeper of certain songs and plant knowledge in their band, who had told Nahlin from childhood that knowledge was the truest kind of wealth, because no one could take it from you on a road. Cole told her about growing up in East Texas, about the farm his father had worked, about the particular kind of poverty that comes from land that's barely yours and weather that doesn't care. He told her how he'd come west because he'd needed to go somewhere the horizon was far enough away that it didn't feel like a wall. He told her things he hadn't said to anyone because there had been no one to say them to. She listened in the way she did everything, fully, without performance. By the time his shoulder was healed enough that he could lift hay bales again, something had settled between them that was different from what had been there in July. It wasn't a question anymore. It was more like a fact that hadn't been named yet. The naming came in late October, when the high desert had turned copper and gold around the base of the mesas, and the mornings smelled of sage after the rain. Nahlin had said, some weeks earlier, that she needed to get word to her people, that her band would be searching for her, would not know if she was alive. Cole had helped her arrange this through a mescalero man he knew from the trade post at Mesilla, a man who traveled the Sacramento country regularly. The word got through. A cousin came south in September, a young man named Taza, who looked at Cole with careful, measuring eyes and spent the better part of an afternoon talking with Nahlin in their language, while Cole found chores on the far side of the barn. When Taza left, he shook Cole's hand and said nothing, but his grip was firm, and he looked Cole in the face when he did it, which Cole took for what it was. Nahlin had a choice now. She could go back. Her people were alive and present, and the Sacramento Mountains were her home, and she had never pretended otherwise. She stayed. She did not explain this at first, and Cole did not ask. But one evening in October, with the first real cold in the air, and the lamp between them on the table throwing its warm circle, she said, "I have been thinking about what I want." Cole set his coffee cup down. "I have thought about it for a long time," she said. She was looking at him with that level, direct gaze of hers. "I want to stay here, with you." A pause. "If that is something you want." Cole Hartley was not a man who spoke easily about what he felt. He'd been a quiet man before Clara died, and a very quiet man after. But he'd learned, in the months since July, that silence could be a gift between people who understood it, and a wall between people who didn't. And he'd gotten very clear in his own mind about which he wanted this to be. He said, "Since about the second week, I haven't been able to picture this place without you in it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then I will stay," she said. He reached across the table, and she let him take her hand. Just that, just his rough rancher's hand around hers, the lamplight steady between them and the cold pressing against the windows, and the coyotes somewhere out in the dark, making their usual racket. He held her hand, and she let him, and the room was very quiet. They were married the following April, when the wildflowers came up along the base of the mesa, and the morning smelled of sage after the rain. It was a small thing. A circuit preacher who passed through twice a year, 2 witnesses from the nearest neighboring ranch, a short ceremony in the yard with the horses looking on from the fence, and the Guadalupe Mountains blue in the distance. Nahlin wore her beadwork collar and her grandmother's turquoise earrings. Cole wore the clean shirt he'd been saving. Afterward, standing in the yard in the morning light, Cole looked at the hill where his graves were, where Clara and James rested, looking west. He thought about what Nahlin had told him that first fall, that the ones we lose don't go far, that they stay close to the places that knew them best. He thought that if that was true, they'd been watching this whole time. And he thought they'd have approved. Nahlin came to stand beside him. She followed his eyes to the hill. "They will know you are not alone anymore," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the hill, her face open and still. "No," he said. "I'm not." He had gone out to check a fence line on a July afternoon 2 years before, with nothing to his name but his grief and his habits. He came back with something he hadn't been looking for and hadn't known he needed. A woman who moved before the wind. A woman whose knowledge had saved their lives. A woman who had looked at the emptiness in him and not been frightened by it, but had simply, quietly, begun filling it in. It cost him a bullet and a bad shoulder and 6 weeks of being a terrible patient. He would have paid 10 times that. He knew it the way he knew the land, bone deep, without needing to put it into words. The ranch ran well that spring. The cattle came through the winter in good condition. Cole fixed the barn's north lean at last, with Nahlin handing him boards and not pretending not to notice when he measured wrong. She planted 3 rows of corn on the east side of the stone house in the way her grandmother had taught, hilling the soil and interplanting squash at the base. Cole built a second porch bench so there'd be room for two. The high desert kept its silence. But that silence had changed its character. It wasn't the silence of one man and his grief anymore. It was the silence of two people who had come to trust it together. That kind of quiet is its own kind of music, if you've ever heard it. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like Cole and Nahlin's are what we're here to tell. Stories about what happens when one person is brave enough to step toward another, across every wall the world has built between them. We'll be back with another one soon.